Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today, going way back in time to explore ancient India. Specifically, we'll be looking at the social and economic structures.
Such a fascinating area, and you've provided some incredible sources.
I thought so too. There's so much to uncover, but we'll pull out some of the most interesting parts for everyone.
Sounds like a plan.
So maybe we should start with the people. To understand the structure of any civilization, we got to know who was there, right?
Exactly. And when we talk about ancient Indian society, we can't ignore the Varna system.
Right, the Varna system, I remember reading about it, like a framework that organized people into four main groups.
Yeah, four main groups. And it's often called the caste system, but that term, it came later and doesn't capture the whole picture.
Oh, how so?
Well, the Varna system was initially more about what you did, your occupation, rather than like a rigid, fixed category you were born into.
Okay, that makes sense. So who are these four groups?
Well, first you have the Brahmanas. Think priests, scholars, teachers.
The keepers of knowledge and spiritual guides, essentially.
Exactly. And then there were the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers.
The protectors and leaders. Every society needs those. What about the folks driving the economy?
That would be the Vaishyas. They were the traders, the merchants, the agriculturalists, really kept things moving.
Okay, so those were three. Who was the fourth group?
The fourth group was the Shudras. They were the laborers, the artisans, those who provided essential services to support the other three Varnas.
So each Varna had a specific role to play to make society function.
That was the idea, harmony and functionality. Of course, like any system, it wasn't perfect.
And I imagine over time, things probably shifted.
Yeah, over time it became more rigid, social mobility decreased.
So that's where we get this idea of the caste system, born into a role and staying there.
Exactly. And within each Varna, even more specific subcastes called jatis emerged.
Further solidifying the hierarchy. And I'm guessing this is where we start to see a real social divide emerge.
Unfortunately, you're right. People considered outside the Varna system altogether, those labeled untouchables, were given tasks considered impure.
That's a pretty stark contrast to the idea of harmony we talked about earlier. I wonder, with this rigid hierarchy, how did it actually play out in the economy? Did the Varna system really dictate what people could and couldn't do for work?
It definitely had an influence, but it's also important to remember that people found ways to make a living. Take agriculture, for example.
Agriculture, that was the backbone of ancient India's economy, right?
Exactly. And you would find people from all the Varnas involved, just in different ways.
So even the Brahmanas at the top of the system were involved in agriculture.
To a degree, yeah. Owning land was a sign of status and power. They might not be out tilling the fields themselves, but could benefit from agricultural production.
That makes sense. I'm curious, what kind of crops were they growing back then?
Oh, all sorts. Imagine vast fields of staples like rice, wheat, barley.
Providing the foundation of their diet? Anything else?
Sugarcane was a big one, and cotton too, so clearly a textile industry existed.
Food, clothing. Agriculture really was the heart of everything.
And don't forget the livestock. Cattle were incredibly important in ancient India.
For food, I'm guessing?
Milk and ghee, yes, essential parts of their diet. But cattle were also crucial as working animals, helping with agriculture.
So they really got a lot of use out of them.
Absolutely. Even the dung was valuable, dried, and used as fuel.
Wow, talk about resourcefulness. But it wasn't all just farming, right? I'm picturing skilled artisans as well.
Definitely. You had metal workers creating tools and weapons, weavers, potters, making all kinds of beautiful things.
Adding to the richness of ancient Indian society.
Yeah.
I'd love to see those workshops in action.
It would be quite a sight, but it makes you wonder, how did they move all these goods around?
Yeah, how did all of this get from place to place? Did they have established trade routes and systems of exchange back then?
Oh, absolutely. Think caravans packed with spices, grains, textiles, all crisscrossing the land, connecting different regions.
Wow. So they had robust internal trade networks. But what about currency? How did they handle transactions?
That's where the punch-marked coins come in. These early coins, usually made of silver, were quite sophisticated for the time.
So they had standardized currency. It's fascinating to think about those coins changing hands.
And it wasn't just internal trade. Ancient India had connections to the wider world.
So external trade routes too, like where were they trading with?
Think as far as Rome. Ships laden with goods sailing across the sea. It's incredible.
That's a huge distance. Clearly they weren't isolated. But all this trade, did they have any kind of organized groups, like for merchants and artisans?
They're thinking of guilds, right. They were called shrenis in ancient India, and they played a big role.
So they weren't just social clubs.
Not at all. They regulated trade, set standards, and even provided support for their members.
It sounds like the foundations of what we'd consider, like, chambers of commerce today.
You could say that. And some of these guilds even had branches in other cities, even foreign lands.
So really sophisticated and interconnected. We've covered the social hierarchy with the Varna system, the importance of agriculture, and now this whole intricate world of trade.
And they all tied together, influenced each other. It's really fascinating how interconnected everything was.
We've painted quite a picture here. But I'm ready to zoom in a bit more and actually see how people lived.
I like where you're going with this. Let's explore the cities and villages of ancient India. It's amazing to think about, these cities and villages, like, what were they actually like?
I know, right? We've talked about all these big systems, but I want to see what life was like for people.
Well, from the sources you've given, it sounds like there was a big difference between urban and rural life.
I bet. So what about these cities? Paint me a picture.
Okay, imagine you're in Pataliputra, a major urban center back then.
Pataliputra. That was a pretty important city, right? Wasn't it like a capital for some empires?
You got it. And the descriptions we have, it sounds like a really impressive place. Wide streets, shops everywhere, houses, marketplaces overflowing with goods, and of course these grand palaces.
It sounds so busy, I can almost hear the noise.
And amidst all the hustle and bustle, you'd find these incredible temples.
Oh, yeah. Ancient India was very spiritual, right?
Exactly. These temples were vital not just for worship, but as centers for community life.
So they had this economic energy, this spiritual energy. It must have been quite a mix.
And don't forget about the public spaces, parks, gardens, places to get away from it all.
Okay, so the city sounds pretty well-rounded, but not everyone lived in a place like that, right? What about the villages?
Yeah. Village life was much more, simple. Agriculture was everything.
I bet. Like, just picture fields stretching out as far as you can see.
Exactly. A slower pace of life, close-knit communities. But that doesn't mean they were unstructured. They had village councils to make decisions and keep things running smoothly.
So like a local government of sorts. Did they have any specialized crafts or industries in the villages? Or was it all just farming?
Agriculture was definitely the focus, but you'd still have skilled artisans in the villages.
So even in this simple life, there was still that need for specialized skills.
For sure. Potters, weavers, blacksmiths, these were all essential roles.
It's interesting how everyone had their part to play no matter where they lived.
And remember, these villages weren't completely isolated. Trade routes connected them to towns and cities.
Right, so they still had a link to the wider world.
Exactly. And that connection went beyond just trade. Festivals, cultural events, these brought people from different villages together.
So even with the differences between city and village life, there were still things that tied everyone together. It's fascinating to see all these different facets of ancient India.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Now I'm thinking about the people themselves. Like, what did their homes look like? What did they eat? What did they do for fun?
Okay, yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty of daily life.
So let's start with housing. As you might expect, it really depended on where you lived and your social standing.
Makes sense. So in the cities.
In the cities, wealthy folks might have had big houses made of brick or stone, while those who were less well-off might have lived in more modest dwellings made of wood or mud brick.
And in the villages.
Village homes were definitely simpler, using materials they could find locally. Mud, thatch, bamboo, practical and functional.
I bet those houses were filled with amazing smells, all those spices.
Speaking of spices, the ancient Indian diet was largely vegetarian. Lots of rice, wheat, lentils, vegetables, and of course, spices to make it all delicious.
Sounds pretty healthy. Was there any meat in their diet?
For most people, no, but for those who could afford it, meat might have been eaten occasionally, like for a special event.
So even food choices were tied to social and economic factors.
Oh, for sure. And religion played a big part too, shaping all sorts of things, from food to customs to art.
Speaking of art, I'm curious, how did they spend their leisure time? Did they have any fun activities back then?
Oh, they knew how to have a good time. Think storytellers captivating audiences with tales of heroes and gods. Imagine music and dancing, those rhythmic beats and graceful movements.
It sounds like a really lively culture.
It was. And these weren't just performances. They brought people together, strengthened communities and passed down traditions.
So entertainment had a deeper purpose as well.
Exactly. And let's not forget about games. They had board games, dice games, things to challenge the mind and have some fun.
They really did seem to have a balance. Work, spirituality, leisure. We're getting a real sense of who these people were.
That's what's so cool about history. It's not just facts and figures. It's about connecting with the people who lived back then, understanding their lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of understanding, I'm curious about their education system.
Mhm.
How did they pass down knowledge? What did they value when it came to learning?
Now you're asking the right questions. Education was hugely important in ancient India. It was seen as crucial for both individual and societal growth. But like many things, access wasn't always equal. It really did. The Varna system played a big role in who received what kind of education.
Okay, so how did that work? Who were the main educators?
Well, traditionally, the Brahmanas were the keepers of knowledge, right? They were the ones running the Gurukuls.
Gurukuls. Those were like the schools.
Yeah, think of them as residential schools. Students would live with their teacher, the guru.
Wow, that's a pretty immersive experience.
Yeah.
So what were these Gurukuls actually like?
Picture a simple building, maybe in a quiet area surrounded by nature. And the guru would teach through oral instruction, lots of discussion and debate.
So pretty different from how we learn today. Who were these students? Were they all Brahmanas?
Most of them were, yeah, typically young boys from Brahmin families. They would memorize texts, have philosophical discussions, learn all the rituals and practices associated with their Varna.
It sounds like a demanding education, focused on both the mind and the spirit. Did girls receive this kind of education too?
For girls, it was different. They usually received education at home, learning more domestic skills.
Okay, so a bit of a gender divide there. What about children from other Varnas? Did they go to the Gurukuls?
Not usually. They were more likely to learn the family trade. A blacksmith's son would learn from his father, you know.
So practical skills passed down through generations. But I imagine there were exceptions. People who wanted to learn something outside their prescribed role.
Oh, absolutely. There were always those who broke the mold. Maybe they'd find a guru willing to teach them, or they'd learn through experience, observation, self-study.
The thirst for knowledge finds a way. It's inspiring to think about. So in these Gurukuls, what kinds of subjects were considered important?
Well, religious texts were a big focus, like the Vedas, the Upanishads. But they also learned things like grammar, logic, astronomy, math, even medicine.
Wow, they covered a lot of ground. It was a well-rounded education, huh?
Yeah, they aimed to develop the whole person. And it wasn't just about the academic stuff. Ethical conduct, moral values, respect for elders, these were all important too.
They understood that knowledge without values isn't enough.
Exactly. They knew knowledge should be used to understand the world and your place in it, to live a good life, and to contribute to society.
That's a powerful idea and something we can all learn from, no matter where we come from or what time period we live in.
I think so too. It's fascinating to see how these ancient civilizations approached education.
It really is. This whole deep dive into ancient India has been incredible. We've uncovered so much, the social structures, the economic systems, even the food they ate and the games they played, and now we're seeing this rich tradition of learning and knowledge.
It's a reminder that ancient civilizations were full of complexities and contradictions, just like our own, and they have so much to teach us.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for guiding us through this journey. It's been an absolute pleasure learning from you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time, ready to explore a whole new corner of history. Until then, keep learning.